You hear the sound of hooves before you see the flames. It is not the fire that chills you, but the silence between the thunder of horses, the way the earth itself seems to hold its breath. In that silence, conquest does not come as steel against flesh, but as something more intimate, an invasion that does not stop at walls or gates, but enters bloodlines themselves. And before we step deeper into this haunting history, pause for a moment with me. This channel is more than a voice telling stories of the past. It's a gathering place where thousands from across the globe listen together. From cities lit with skyscrapers to villages tucked beneath mountains, you are part of this living archive. So let me ask, where are you watching from tonight? Tell us in the comments, subscribe if you haven't, and let's uncover this hidden empire together. The chronicles of the Mongols usually begin with their armies. Endless waves of cavalry, banners whipping in the wind, the ground trembling with the charge of warriors. But beyond the spectacle of battlefield brilliance lay another, quieter conquest, one rarely carved into monuments or celebrated in epic poems. It was the conquest of the body, the transformation of intimacy into empire. When the first Mongol detachments approached a city, the choice they offered was brutally simple: surrender and live, or resist and be annihilated. Yet the meaning of annihilation went beyond death. To resist was to invite the obliteration not only of homes and temples, but of families, of futures, of the very capacity of a people to reproduce themselves free of foreign will. The fire that consumed their streets was only the beginning. The true destruction came after the flames. Persian chroniclers wrote with horror of what followed the breach of a city wall. Populations were divided swiftly, like cattle sorted by age and worth. Men of fighting age often met the sword. Children were gathered, some enslaved, others discarded as burdens. And women were seized not merely as trophies of war, but as resources, calculated and catalogued. The Mongols did not see them as incidental spoils. They saw them as the raw material of empire. In the ashes of a ruined quarter, a survivor might hear the clipped voices of officers allocating the living. "The Khan must have the finest," one might mutter. Another replies, "This one, the daughter of a noble house, send her to Karakoram." The language is cold, transactional. What the Mongols had perfected was the conversion of conquest into intimacy, intimacy into lineage, lineage into legacy. Was this simply cruelty, a barbarian's lust let loose on the world? Or was it something far more calculated? The records suggest it was the latter. Spies had already scouted which families were renowned for beauty, which clans for fertility, which households carried bloodlines worth absorbing. By the time the gates fell, the fate of many had already been written. The strategy was devastating in its elegance. Kill the men, scatter the children, absorb the women. In one generation, resistance was erased not only from the battlefield, but from the cradle. Sons born of these unions grew into warriors whose loyalties lay with the empire. Daughters carried Mongol blood into households that had once sworn to destroy them. Without lifting another blade, the Mongols ensured that their enemies would become, in time, their kin. Imagine the fear this inspired. News of slaughter traveled fast across Asia, but the whispers that followed were even more terrifying. Entire towns surrendered without resistance, not because they feared death alone, but because they feared what life under the Mongols would mean, the certainty that their daughters' bodies would become extensions of the empire. This was not a rumor. It was a policy, repeated too consistently across too many sources to dismiss. Chinese court records describe women delivered as tribute, recorded with the same bureaucratic neatness as bolts of silk or herds of horses. Names erased, new titles assigned, their bodies became both spoils and symbols. The conqueror's tent was not just a place of celebration but of empire-making, where intimacy itself was staged as theater, each union a declaration of dominance. And yet, within the shadows of this machinery, fragments of resistance glimmer. Some women took their own lives rather than be parceled out. Others disappeared into the chaos, fleeing into deserts or mountains where Mongol patrols seldom reached. Chroniclers recall families destroying their own daughters to deny the enemy his prize. Such acts haunt the record not for their rarity but for their desperation, small flames of defiance against a system designed to extinguish them. The city may have burned in a night, but its bloodline could be unmade in a single generation. That was the genius and the horror of the Mongol system. Not just to conquer land, but to conquer time itself, rewriting the future in their image. And so the Empire of Shadows grew, not always visible in the banners raised or the fortresses toppled, but in the quiet corridors of intimacy where conquest was renewed night after night. An empire written not only in chronicles and ruins, but in flesh, in blood, in the whispered cries that history could not silence. The fires of that first night might fade, leaving only embers in the dark. But the true conquest, the conquest of families, of futures, remained, burning unseen. And as we step deeper into this story, one question looms like smoke over a broken city. If land could be won by armies, what does it mean when blood itself becomes the battlefield? Victory, in the Mongol imagination, was not only a map painted in new colors, it was measured in bodies, in wombs, in the silent arithmetic of generations yet unborn. When their banners unfurled over a captured city, the conquest did not end with the crackle of flames or the clang of falling gates. It entered another register, colder, more intimate, the tallying of human lives as resources to be harvested, assigned, and consumed. The process was methodical. Chroniclers describe how populations were separated into groups as though sorted by unseen hands. Men who posed a threat, warriors, leaders, scholars, were struck down, their blood soaking the earth. The elderly, the frail, those deemed unproductive were swept aside. And then came the moment of division that defined Mongol rule, the cataloging of women and children. It was not a frenzy of lust or chaos as one might imagine in the wake of war. It was chillingly organized, with commanders and officers overseeing the distribution as though handling livestock. Bring forth the daughters of the noble houses, one Persian account recalls, for the Khan's tent must shine with beauty. The phrasing is clinical, almost ceremonial. To the Mongols, beauty itself was a form of tribute. High-born women, especially those of famed families, were singled out for the ruling elite. Others were divided among officers and soldiers, distributed as payment for loyalty and valor. But this was no random apportioning. Intelligence networks had already mapped these cities long before their walls were breached. Merchants and spies whispered which clans carried daughters of rare beauty, which households bore many children, which families were known for strength and vigor. The Mongols kept these notes like ledgers, ensuring that when conquest came, it struck not only the defenses of a city but the very continuity of its bloodline. Chinese records describe women listed alongside herds of horses and sacks of grain in tribute documents. They were quantified, catalogued, and transported with the same bureaucratic precision. The Mongols understood instinctively what later empires would learn through science, that to master a people utterly, one must master their capacity to reproduce. And so, women became not only prizes of war, but the machinery of empire itself. The reward system turned cruelty into structure. Warriors were promised captives as the spoils of loyalty, and the hierarchy was explicit. Commanders had first choice, their tents filled with the most celebrated beauties. Officers followed, selecting from what remained. Rank-and-file soldiers received their portion only if they had distinguished themselves in the chaos of battle. Desire was transformed into incentive, brutality into currency. To resist the empire was to invite annihilation. To serve it was to be fed with the bodies of the conquered. But the true weight of this system lay in what came after. Women who conceived were monitored with care, not out of compassion, but because they represented future resources of the empire. A woman who bore a son with Mongol features was often allowed to live, her child destined to be raised as a warrior of the horde. A daughter, likewise, might be absorbed into Mongol households. But children who retained the look of their mother's people could be discarded, sold, or sacrificed. Birth itself became a test of usefulness, and motherhood was twisted into a leash of submission. Persian chronicler Malik Juvaini described the terror that swept through captured cities. Families destroyed their own daughters rather than see them fed into the system. Some women leapt from walls as the gates collapsed, seeking death on their own terms. Others endured, knowing that refusal would only bring agony. For those who survived, daily life was structured around constant vigilance. They were watched, counted, used, and reminded that their worth lay in their ability to perpetuate the empire's blood. Imagine the psychological weight of this reality. To know that your body was no longer your own, that your children might be taken, that your bloodline itself was being diluted by design. Fear became generational. Even before the horsemen arrived, entire regions surrendered rather than risk the fate they knew awaited them. In this way, the Mongols expanded faster than their cavalry could ride. Terror itself rode ahead, hollowing out resistance before the first arrow was loosed. Archaeological evidence confirms what the chronicles whisper. Burial sites across Central Asia reveal mass graves of women and children, their remains marked by violence, their DNA interwoven with distant Mongol lineages. The earth itself remembers what the records cannot fully capture, that conquest was not only a question of territory, but of biology. And still, the question lingers. How could such a system endure? How could so many accept silence in the face of it? Perhaps it was the sheer scale, the overwhelming weight of empire. Perhaps it was the knowledge that to resist meant not only death, but the obliteration of one's descendants. The blood harvest was not waged with the clash of steel or the smoke of burning citadels. It was carried out in courtyards, in tents, in the dark corners of households where women bore the empire's future in silence. It was conquest etched into the flesh of generations. As the empire spread, the world began to understand. Land could be lost and won again, but blood, once taken, could never be reclaimed. And in that truth lies the most haunting lesson of all, that the deepest conquest is not of earth or stone, but of the human future itself. Centuries have passed since the thunder of hooves faded, since the banners of the Khan were torn down by wind and rain. Yet the empire endures in silence, not in monuments, but in marrow. Every cell is an archive, every bloodline a page of conquest written without ink or script. When modern scientists extract DNA from bones buried beneath Central Asian soil, they do not find absence. They find the empire whispering back. The chronicles gave us fragments of the story. Scribes who described the division of captives, poets who mourned daughters stolen in the night, survivors who told of noble families cut down while their women were absorbed into Mongol households. Ruins still scar the landscape, toppled walls and burned-out cities standing as mute witnesses. But the most enduring testimony is not stone or parchment. It is the quiet inheritance carried by millions of living people today, hidden beneath the surface of their skin, carried forward with every heartbeat. In 2003, a genetic survey startled the world. Researchers found that nearly 1 in 200 men across the globe bore Y chromosome markers that traced back to a single lineage, one rooted in Mongolia during the era of Genghis Khan. The discovery was less a revelation than a confirmation. What the chronicles had whispered, what the ruins had hinted, the genome now declared with certainty. The Mongol conquest was not merely of land or people, but of reproduction itself. Consider the implications. The sweep of conquest that stretched from the Pacific to the Black Sea did not vanish with the decline of Mongol rule. It embedded itself into the very future, generation upon generation, carrying the imprint of a domination that cared as much for bloodlines as for fortresses. The empire dissolved, but its signature lived on in flesh, passed quietly from father to son, mother to child, century after century. The evidence goes beyond a single lineage. Archaeologists unearthing burial sites in Central Asia have uncovered mass graves of women and children, their remains bearing marks of violence, their DNA revealing mixtures that should never have existed in such sudden abundance. Bloodlines that once stood apart, Persian, Chinese, Russian, Turkic, were fused in the crucible of conquest. Some unions were born of violence, others of coerced assimilation, but the result was the same. A rewiring of populations at a scale the world had never seen. Is this not conquest in its most permanent form? Armies retreat, cities rebuild, names fade from stone, but the genome persists. Every child born carried within them a ledger of past violence, a reminder that empire's deepest reach was into the unborn. What is sovereignty when one's descendants no longer resemble the past, when even heritage itself has been colonized? Chronicles speak of daughters gifted to generals, of women assigned like coin to soldiers, of noble lines extinguished or swallowed whole. Juvaini, the Persian historian, once described a scene in which the Khan's commanders debated which captured women should be sent eastward as tribute and which should remain with the army. He does not dwell on their faces, only their numbers, as if they were tallied assets, sorted like herds. How could he know that centuries later, scientists would read the record not in ink, but in nucleotide sequences? That every forgotten captive, nameless in the chronicles, might still speak today through strands of DNA? The haunting truth is this: every embrace that followed conquest, whether forced or coerced, was also an act of empire. A woman carrying a Mongol child became part of a system that extended power not only through fear, but through biology. And her descendants, whether they knew it or not, bore testimony to a history that no monument could erase. Some may have grown to wield power themselves, their blood tying them to both the conquered and the conqueror. Others lived anonymous lives, yet even their anonymity carried within it a trace of empire. Picture the marketplaces of Samarkand centuries later, caravans streaming through its gates, merchants calling out in Persian, Arabic, Turkic, and Mongolian tongues. Within that chorus, thousands bore within their bodies the silent consequence of policies written not in edicts, but in unions arranged under coercion. The bazaar hummed with trade, yet beneath the hum was an inheritance that no coin could measure. In cities today, the silence lingers. A man in Tehran, or Almaty, or Moscow may walk unaware that his Y chromosome traces to the steppes. A woman in Beijing or Delhi may never know that her mitochondrial DNA carries the echo of a lineage redirected centuries ago. This is the silence of empire, unseen, unfelt, yet alive in every heartbeat. But silence can be more chilling than memory. For what does it mean that conquest endures in our veins? That a war fought with fire and steel became a legacy that shapes families, nations, even identities in the present? The genome does not moralize. It does not distinguish between love and violence, between willing union and coercion. It records only that life continued, that empire succeeded in its quietest, most intimate strategy. Imagine a young scholar in a laboratory today, peering through sequencing machines at fragments of code glowing on a screen. To her, the story is not abstract. It is living. She traces the threads across continents, and the data sketches a map not unlike the empire itself. Where scribes once inked borders on parchment, the genome redraws them in blood. And in that moment, science does not uncover something new. It merely confirms what history already whispered, that the conquest never truly ended. History teaches us that empires rise and fall, yet here lies a paradox. Though the Mongol banners are gone, their legacy remains more enduring than marble, more stubborn than parchment. Every descendant is a living monument, unknowing yet undeniable. No temple or palace can rival this permanence, for the body itself became the archive. And so we return to the question that has haunted each chapter. What is conquest if not the power to dictate the future? The Mongols understood that the most absolute victory is not in burning a city, but in reshaping the generations that follow. They turned reproduction into strategy, intimacy into infrastructure, and lineage into a weapon sharper than any sword. The empire breathed still, not in the ruins of Karakorum, not in the chronicles of fearful scribes, but in the quiet rhythm of countless human bodies scattered across continents. In the pulse of a vein, in the spiral of a chromosome, in the silent continuity of life itself, the conquest endures. You may never know if it whispers in yours.